at a later point, you're welcome to do that, and you should have that by this afternoon. At the end of the presentation today, we're going to open it up for conversation and questions. So we'll allow you to unmute yourself. We'd love for you to join us by video so that we can see you, and we'll just carry on the conversation from there. But I want to go ahead and introduce our guest this morning, who's going to be talking about crisis communication and really just tips for creating and delivering key messages to your customers, the media, and other stakeholders and partners that you may have. And we're doing this today in partnership with the Blue Ridge Public Relations Society of America. So happy that they were willing to work with us on this. So our guests today are Chris Turnbull. I want to introduce him. Hi, Chris. He's the Director of Corporate Communications and Operational Continuity at Carilion Clinic. He's also the president of the Blue Ridge chapter of PRSA. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to hear what you have to say. And then I also want to introduce Thomas Becher, who's on with us. Hello. Hey there. And he's the Director of Marketing and PR Services at ECU Communications, and he's a former Roanoke Valley resident. So, Thomas, thank you for joining us back again to talk about this. And before we get into the presentation, I want to take a quick second to thank Heather Fay, who's on the line with us. Hi, Heather. She helped pull all this together. She heard Chris and Thomas speak. I think we decided it was 6 years ago on a similar topic, and really enjoyed the conversation and was able to remember a lot of the nuggets that they shared. So that's pretty impressive 6 years later. So we just couldn't wait to get them together and bring them to you. And thank you, Heather, for helping us coordinate all of that. I really appreciate you. Okay, so Chris and Thomas, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Great. Well, next slide, please. And I'm delighted to be here. I know Chris is as well, and it's good to see so many folks I know from my Roanoke days, and I'm glad to be caught up with you. Just as you know, I left the Roanoke Valley. I'm in Old Town Manassas right now with a great little agency, and we're doing a lot of federal work right now, which is interesting. It's a little different, but it's interesting, and I do miss my Roanoke people, so I'm glad to be here. Thank you. What's a crisis? Well, we're in one now as a planet, but more specifically, as we ask this question of what's a crisis, I want you to think about your own business, your own situation, what can go wrong, and we'll get to that certainly later. But as a definition, right, it's an event, a situation, an issue, a change that can harm your business, right? Lead to loss of customers and revenue. We're seeing that now. I used to be in the airline industry, and that industry has been decimated by this COVID-19. And so they're thinking not just a crisis now, but in the future in terms of revenue. A crisis is something that can damage your reputation. And that's something that I know Chris does a lot of with Carilion. It just is something that happens, whether it's to you or by you, or at no fault to you, but something that can ultimately hurt you. And then there's the aspect of your business continuity, right? You can have a crisis, but can you have sustainability in a business because something happened to your core function? And a crisis is something that can change the industry. Every industry has shift changes. We're seeing that now, right? If you're in retail, boy, you're thinking, what's the next step for me? Or airlines or healthcare. So almost virtually everyone who's on the line is thinking about how their industry is going to change in response to a crisis. So in other words, it's anything that overwhelms or could potentially overwhelm your resources. Not those of us who do crisis communications, that's our line of work, but for small business owners, for managers, that's not something that comes along every day. So we'll talk a little bit about this so that at the end of this, you have a sense of what you need to be thinking about and doing and preparing for that next crisis. So next slide, please.
So as everybody has gathered by now, a crisis can hit almost at any time. And Thomas mentioned it, but it's more difficult to be interactive in these types of Zoom calls as it would be in a typical audience, live audience scenario. But I really would encourage you to think through, maybe even jot down a couple notes on what you think could go wrong in your business. What would signify a crisis in your world? And we'll try to, with those examples that you're writing down, we'll try to walk through some different ways of approaching your planning and your communications around that. The one thing I would say about crisis planning is everything comes down to putting order around a chaotic situation. So trying to get your hands around something and putting order around what might look like chaos from any number of standpoints. And that is a lot of what you saw happen a couple months ago as we started dealing with this pandemic, and even as we've gone through it and have had to adjust different policies and procedures. I'm sure everybody here has had to make some changes to the way they do their work and the way their customers are responding to their needs. But that is the bulk of what we do when we do some planning. We can get to the next slide.
Yeah. So, what can go wrong? Well, this is just a small smidgen of that. And so I want you to think about this from your own business's perspective. But for example, a fire, right? That can happen anytime, even if you take all the precautions of having sprinklers and all these things, right? Flooding, right? Roanoke Valley gets a lot of that. Any other severe weather event that hits everyone geographically. A computer breach. Your clients, social numbers are out there in the dark web. That's a crisis that a lot of companies, in fact, big and small, have seen in the last few years. Electrical outages, internet outages, something that literally affects the continuity of your business. It can also be an enormous crisis for you. Workplace violence, that's one that we've seen a lot of, right? A small business can open up their shop or their office like any regular morning, and 10 minutes later be on the front page, of the news websites because of something that happened on site. It could be an accident, not just where there may be an injury or even a death. We see that a lot in manufacturing and other businesses as well. You could have an online smear campaign. We see a lot of folks using social media to let's say, ply around with some myth truths. And so that could definitely impact your business, especially if things aren't true or exaggerated or someone has a bone to pick with you. Pandemic and illness, we're seeing that now. I don't think, while folks like Chris historically in his role in previous jobs has thought about this a lot, I think the average business owner has not thought about anything beyond the seasonal flu. And I'm not trying to tie the two together, but I think people's thought of, hey, what's an illness, and oh, well, that's 2 days out of commission. Well, no, now we're seeing not just a longer term structural change in the business, but man, what am I going to do going forward? A death of a company leader. I did a couple of those cases in my corporate days where all of a sudden the CEO is dead for various reasons. And so business continuity and confidence in the business, all that disappears, and that is a crisis. So these are just really a small sampling. And what I want you to think about, and maybe feel free to discuss at the end of this, if not, take some notes, but what specifically to your business can we add to this list that keeps you up at night?
You can go to the next slide. So this is I take it that this presentation will be available to those attending. Is that right, Heather? Great. So this is a slide that I've used for a number of years to help identify the priority for the threats that an individual company or organization is facing. And the way it works is you pick let's say fire. Fires are relatively standard threats for just about everybody out there. But you have mitigated them, many because of OSHA standards and other fire life safety standards that your companies have. So it minimizes the threat a little bit. So let's throw fire on this grid here. So fire could have a pretty significant impact. In fact, my family experienced a house fire and it kept us out of the house for 9 months. So it was a significant impact. The risk to, the likelihood of that fire happening is, I would say, possible, right? It's not unheard of. We all use electricity. We all cook on stoves. There are things that in our lives, fire is not, it's not an unusual thing in our lives, so controlled fires. But then you take a look at the mitigation measures that you put into place. So maybe you've got sprinklers, maybe you've got a fire extinguisher. You perhaps practice fire drills, and schools do this a lot. And you plot fire on this grid based on the mitigation measures that you put in place. So I would say fire is still probably in that medium range, maybe right in the center of this grid, where major injuries could occur, damage or loss would be greater or around 20%. Budget impacts, there would be potentially local media coverage, and it would disrupt your operations. So the impact would be pretty moderate on that part. And I'll just give you from a hospital and healthcare environment, we handle about 5 fire alarms in each hospital every month. And most of those aren't actually fires. It's dust or it's smoke related to something else, or steam for that matter. But they still occur. We're still responding to them regularly. So I would say there's a medium possibility that would happen. That would plot it here, plot your other threats, and then determine those that are in the high and critical, those are your priorities. Pandemic for most companies did not reach that list this year. We have been talking about pandemics. Thomas was referring to some of my previous work when I worked for the World Bank and different UN agencies. Pandemic was a big threat on our horizon 15 years ago. I planned for H1N1, planned for the swine flu. We actually had the patient zero, or the index case of the swine flu in the Washington, D.C. metro area when I was working there. And we considered that a pretty high threat, and planned accordingly. And those plans have actually come in really helpful as I've helped Carilion address the issues that we're facing now. But that's how you prioritize. This grid is a great way to prioritize the planning that you might need to do. There are other things that you're going to say, we accept the risk, we accept that that's a threat, and we're not going to be able to get it down to that negligible or nil, and no matter what we do, and we just have to be prepared for it. We have to have plans in place to handle it if it were to come. Those are the so-called black swan events, those rare but disastrous events that could happen. I wouldn't necessarily put pandemic in that, because we have known for a while that this is likely on our radar screen. What I think is most unique about this, though, is I think we generally had a limited understanding of how governments and other agencies would respond, even though they, in many cases, had plans too. It was hard to fit all those pieces together and have a pretty clear understanding of what might be their responses or their reactions. You can go ahead to the next slide.
I'll take this one, and just to build on the last slide, if you take your own situation as a business owner or manager, you can customize that in any way. So a lot of that speaks to some very dramatic things, but honestly, a crisis can be less than dramatic. It could be a simmering thing that can eventually cause some harm. So the key to all this, with the chart in mind that you just saw, is planning. A crisis plan is something that every corporation, every company, frankly, every business should have. Not everyone does. So we wanted to give you a little sense of why planning is important and why it matters. And if you think about it this way, if something happens to you that you thought of or even didn't think of, and you considered a crisis to your business, do you start from running around the office and freaking out, or do you go to a plan that you've got ready to go and hopefully rehearsed and updated to see what you need to be doing? It takes a lot of the guessing game out of those first few hours of turmoil. And as the slide says, really the difference between recovery and failure. We've seen a lot of examples in the corporate world of companies who just didn't recover or it took a long time to recover from a crisis. Think about BP. TWA as a brand, for example, ceased to exist following a crisis and a botched crisis response. So in other words, it allows you to be proactive and respond versus react. And again, it could be scaled. So if you're a Carilion, your crisis plan is going to be a lot more comprehensive than, say, a small retail establishment, for example. It also makes sure, and we'll talk about messaging later, but it makes sure that your messages and resources are aligned. What are you telling people? How are you able to get that message out? All these things can be thought about before a crisis hits. Otherwise, again, you're not being very proactive. And frankly, you'll be overwhelmed. Whether it is consoling employees or dealing with them, having the media knock on your door, taking frantic calls from customers, whatever the situation is, you will be overwhelmed. And having a plan, even if it's not perfect, will at least take some of that stress out of the equation. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the elements typically put in our crisis communications plan, but I want to take a step back and add to what Thomas had said earlier. Having that plan is crucial. What I can say about plans is they rarely go just the way they're written, but it's that act of planning, that process of planning where you've thought through things in different ways that really helps organizations add to their toolbox in a crisis. And that's what you want to have. You want to have the ability to think through, move the chess pieces around on a board. What if we did that? How would the public react, or how would our employees react? Mm-hmm. I'll say, and we're not going to talk too much in depth here, but you really need to have a team. You need to have a group of people who would come together, that know about ahead of time, that would come together and say, here's our HR person, our legal person, our comms person, our executive leadership. How are we going to manage this? Let's put our minds together. You will not be able to do this alone. Make sure that you have a team in place, whether that's internal, which I would recommend, or even if you need some external advice or guidance, there are folks like Thomas and others who will help and add that important expertise in as you're working through your plan and working to respond to a crisis. Typically, and I'll move over to our planning elements here. These are the 6 areas, and this is almost a table of contents. So if you were to take this and turn it into a plan, these are basically the 6 buckets that you need to fill. What are the risks that you face, and how prevalent are those risks? So take that grid that we saw a couple slides ago, work through what threats you face, identify the risks, prioritize those, and make that a part of your plan, because that's what you're going to want to go back to on a regular basis, maybe once a year, and say, oh yeah, is a cyber threat still our top risk? Or maybe it's a weather event. We've seen a lot of changes in that. Or maybe it's and unfortunately these do happen, maybe it's a threat from inside, a company culture that needs some work, or an employee who you sort of identify as maybe a challenge, or a former employee. Developing your comms plan, making sure that your messages are in there, and the communications plan, takes into account who you're communicating with, so your audiences. Thomas is going to talk about these in a second, but who are your audiences, frequency of communication, methods of communication. All of that needs to be a part of your plan, so that, again, you're looking at this as a toolbox. Now, maybe not to do exactly as it states in the plan, but to give you some considerations when something pops up. Developing message templates is a crucial element of this, and one key message that you definitely want to have now is your holding message. And a holding message is nothing more complicated than, we're aware of something going on, and we've pulled a team together and we're working on it. We'll get back to you as soon as we have more information. That is essentially what the holding message is. It can be pre-approved so that nobody's having to rush. Your communications person isn't having to rush to get that out through a chain of command to get it approved before they can get it on the street. We had a service level standard when I was at the World Bank that, responding to an incident, the moment we found out that an incident was taking place, we had 5 minutes to get our initial message out to employees. Now that's a pretty steep goal, and we didn't always hit it. By the time that I left that organization, we hit it far more than we did, because we had that process and procedure out of saying, we're aware this is going on, we're working on it, we'll get you more information as soon as we can. Making sure that you have some guidelines in place. So here's the nice part about that. There are a ton of free guidelines, guidance documents out there that can help, for instance, what a spokesperson might need to say. Some just general guidance about what they should and should not say, how they should act, how they should dress, the tone of voice that they should be using. Those things are out there. Those guidelines are useful. It's the type of thing that you just got to practice over and over again. I don't, at this point in my career, I don't look at the guidelines as much because I've used them so often now, they're de rigueur. But for new people on your team, people who might have to stand in if you were unavailable or at the beach or somewhere else, those guidelines are really critical. So that's an important part. One of the things that's changed over the years that I've been doing this, one of the things that's changed my ability to respond is having a small card that just tells me what the 5 or 6 agenda items are for that initial crisis communications meeting, key phone numbers on the back of it, and locations where we might meet. That has changed the game. For those adrenaline pumping moments, that can help center you and get you focused on the right thing. So I highly recommend those. And then, of course, this goes without saying, but I'm going to continue to say it, is train your people, practice your plan, pull your plan out once a year at least, go through it, make sure that it still works the way you thought it did. I'll give you a brief example. When we were dealing with the Smith Mountain Lake shootings a few years ago, 5 years ago now, really, we had in our plan a particular news conference protocol that we would use. And we had identified certain spots where the news media could gather on our campus for a news conference. And it was very quickly apparent to us after we were involved in that shooting that the places that we had chosen were completely inadequate for having 40 satellite trucks, which is what we wound up having in those first few days when media were coming from all the different local markets and the national market. And we had to really think through what that new plan would look like. We've got some new ideas in there, but that we've tested out. But we had to kind of go through that to learn, and practicing probably would have helped us in that part. We can go to the next slide. So the plan, these are the basics of the plan. What does it do? It provides protocols and options that would help us communicate more effectively. And you'll see me talk about transparency a lot. You probably have seen this in the news recently. Transparency is core to responding to a crisis. Healthcare, that's kind of a challenge because we're not able to talk too much about our patients' care, at least in an identifiable way. So we have to be a little bit thoughtful on how we would do that. But that transparency matters a lot, and it does mitigate the risks to reputation. Even if it's a negative story, if you're able to come out quickly and say, man, we screwed up, we're sorry, and here's how we're addressing it, that matters a lot. And let me show you how we're addressing it. That even matters more. And the planning, as Thomas mentioned earlier, it shifts your mindset from a reactionary or a reaction to the crisis itself to a response, which in my mind is more intentional, more measured, and that is really the goal behind the planning and having that team there. And this is an interesting part too. We have a pretty robust incident command system at Carilion. We also had it at the World Bank and larger organizations. That's pretty standard. But sometimes you might activate your crisis communications before that team gets activated, before your full crisis team gets activated, particularly for those crises like Thomas mentioned that are simmering. Like, yeah, we're seeing a quality issue with this particular product, and we're digging into it. And we're not sure exactly what's going on there, but we really need to center ourselves around this issue and make sure that we're aligned in our response and in how we're talking about it, knowing that more information is going to come in the future. So you can think through activating those plans, that team, when you think your resources might be overwhelmed in the future. That's probably the best way to put it. Next slide, please. And then this slide really is the table of contents. So this is literally the table of contents out of my crisis communications plan. It's got our objectives and assumptions, and you might think it's difficult to state objectives for any crisis, and I would say our plan is an all hazards plan, meaning it's not developed for a fire or a flood or a pandemic. It's developed for all hazards. But our objectives are pretty standard. It doesn't matter what scenario we're in. We want to provide clear and consistent communications to our publics, our stakeholders. We want to make sure that information is reliable, that it's accurate and factual. And then we want to allay the concerns of the stakeholders depending on the specific issue. Those are essentially, just rattling off the top of my head, those are essentially the objectives that we put in the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Risk summary relates to the work that we did on that grid. And then the core of the plan are these three phases, the preparation and mitigation phase. So what are we doing now to anticipate what is to come? What can we do to prepare for that? On the top of my booklet, and I wish I had it handy here, I would hold it up and show you. But on the top of my booklet, it says, in case of emergency, turn to page 9, response. And you go to page 9 and it gives you some checklists. Here are the first 5 things you need to do as a leader. Here are the first 5 things you need to do as a communicator. There are considerations. They're not prescribed, but it'll give you some place to go when your adrenaline's pumping and you're trying to figure out what the next step is. And then of course, and I pray that we are nearing this phase of the pandemic, is the recovery phase. Communication is no less important during the recovery phase as it is in all the others. And I didn't mention it before, but in that preparation and mitigation phases, one of the things you want to talk about is how are you preparing your employees for crisis before a crisis happens? How is this going to work? Okay, so you're going to start, for instance, I'll give you our experience in Carilion. We tend to over-communicate in a crisis. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were communicating with staff in a once-a-week email. We had a once every other week leader message, and once a month we spoke to our physicians directly. That cadence changed daily, 7 days a week employee emails, daily leader emails. Here's what's coming, be prepared, and twice a week physician emails. So that each of those audience had direct targeted messages to help them do their job for the next operational period is the lingo, but for the next 24 hours in our case. And that cadence is changing as we move into a recovery phase because those decisions aren't having to be made and changed on a daily basis. But it is important to let your employees know how they'll respond, their role, and communications has a huge part of that. And the last thing, it goes back to that training and practicing. Make sure that you're looking at your plan as you face crises so that you can update those planning documents. It's a standard part of our process is a week or two after the actual crisis event, we'll get together. What went well, what didn't go so well? Let's look at this plan. Do we need to update things? And then let's go ahead and practice it again, and we'll do a tabletop in a few months. So that's the core of a crisis communications plan. We can go to that.
And before I get into the messages, I just want to say that plan or the planning process and everything you've seen can be tailored to your situation, to your business. So it is not necessarily all about what an organization like Carilion does, but really you can take what works for you and still check the boxes. And I know, Chris, we've done this with clients in the past when we were both with NDP. We saw a tremendous value in these tabletop exercises, not just seeing, oops, we didn't think about that, but also to get the confidence of what happens in a crisis and the process down. So I want to shift into messaging. It is essential that an organization, as Chris said, whether it's 5 minutes or 10, but it's essential that an organization at least acknowledges what's happening. And there's a lot of ways to go about that, but accuracy is more important than speed. I think in the era of media and social media, it's all about, hey, who's first with this message. But the fact is, you want to understand what's going on first. So there's a whole component of that in a crisis plan in terms of learning what to say first. But I want to kind of take you through some general points about your message. the expectations, as I said, are enormous. So whether you're a high profile business in a local community, or a large national brand, or an individual, there's going to be a lot of interest in your story, especially if something bad is happening to you, only because it is, in this case, newsworthy. As business owners and managers, and those who are joining us in government and other agencies, you know that social media and media play an enormous role in not just overall communications, but in a time of crisis. And so understanding that and understanding the role of those functions, it's no longer good enough to say, well, let's ignore it. If something happens that's visible, that rises to a certain level, you certainly can't ignore queries from clients or your customers rather, or the social media. When I did a lot of this in the corporate days, it was before social media, so you would at least have 15 minutes to figure out what to say. We don't have that expectation today, when everyone could be live broadcasting within seconds outside your door. And so that brings it up to the holding statement that Chris mentioned earlier. Having a statement, even as a general statement that Chris kind of alluded to say that we're recognizing there's a problem here, we're trying to gather more information, we will be in touch. That alone is enough to hold off, I guess, if you will, further questions. Because if you are in a certain business or a high profile business, there's a lot of media and social media interest, you want to have something to populate your own social site with. You want to have something to give out to the media or to your customers or to your employees, so everyone's kind of on the same page. Next slide, please. I don't know about you, when it comes to understanding messages, I can take about 3 messages at one time before I forget what the heck the first one was about. So our rule of 3, potentially +1, but I like to use 3 messages, so that if you're an organization, your 3 messages in the beginning of a crisis might be: we're aware of the situation, our priorities on the health and safety of our clients and employees, and we've activated our crisis plan, right? So in the beginning, those are the 3 messages we want people to hear, obviously with the focus on health and safety being the top priority. If you need to, each of those messages should be supported by 3 points as well that make the point. So if you say that our health and safety is of utmost importance at this time, you can back that up by saying, we've evacuated the building, we've checked in with all of our, every employee is accounted for if this was a case of that. We're reaching out to our customers right now about that. So you don't have to immediately talk about all those details, but to have those in mind would be nice to say. And a +1 would be if there's a 4th takeaway message. That might be that business continues, or it might be that at this point our focus is on our employees and our customers, and we're working through that right now. So when it comes to communicating in a crisis, simplicity is the key, right? Speed and accuracy is the key. And we never want to speculate, and we never want to say things we don't know. And so waiting a little bit until information comes in is very important in your messaging. Next slide, please. As a business leader, you should know who your key audiences are, right? Your stakeholders. It's not everyone. A lot of businesses make that mistake, especially if they're in the retail environment. Well, we want to serve everyone. Well, it's not. I mean, you have a pecking order, whether it's your customers, investors. If you're a community, then it's obviously your residents. So think about, especially in a time of crisis, who are your most important audiences? Once you understand that, and everyone should know that anyway at this point, go beyond that. What are their psychographics like? What do they do day to day? How do they get their information? Are they heavy consumers of social media, or are they more traditional in terms of broadcast media? If they are on social media, are there certain tools, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc., that they're on? So understanding how they consume media will help you communicate to them in a time of crisis. Next slide, please.
So this, I thought, would be a useful exercise for you all as well. And I would just encourage you to jot down some notes. I know that when I've been in crisis and we've been responding to a crisis, I know that we're doing well if we can get ahead of the needs of the various audiences that we had. And Thomas certainly alluded to that there. What do your customers need? And so we can use the pandemic as an example of that. I would say, one of the things that all customers anywhere are going to need is a feeling that they can be safe walking into your establishment. Are they safe walking into a hospital to get the care they need? Are they safe walking into the barbershop to get a haircut? That is probably one of the key things that we know they need. So as you're thinking now, we've got about a week and a half before the governor ostensibly will start releasing some of the restrictions. What are the things we can do now to encourage and build confidence in your public that you're a safe place to go? What are the arrangements that you have in place? Are you cutting down your waiting room? Are asking people to wait in cars? Are you setting up appointments? That's a key need in this case. But what are some of the other needs that your customers have? Take a second, jot those down, because I think that's going to be important. Thomas and I have been working with the media for decades, collectively 50 years probably between the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of know what they want now. We know what they need, and we know what they need in a crisis. And what you see on the screen here, they want interviews, they want sound, as they call it. They want experts, they want people who can talk through what has just happened, what we think is going to happen, what we're going to speculate about going. Those are the pundits we see all over Talk News. They may not know that they need this, but they definitely need consistent communications. They need a steady stream of reliable, verified information to help them make sense out of whatever the situation is. And the one thing I always try to remind folks is the media are best described as generalists, meaning they have a little bit of knowledge about a lot of things. They are not, generally speaking, again, there are specific reporters, apologies for the ambulance going by, but there are specific reporters who focus in on a very narrow subject. We work with a few health reporters that know healthcare really well. But the vast majority of television news reporters are generalists, and they do not have the depth of knowledge on your area of interest that you do. And so you benefit, they benefit greatly from your expertise. Please sell that. That's critically important. Talking about your employees. So this is a pretty reliable list of what they will likely need in a crisis. They want direction. They want to know where the company is headed, where the organization's headed, what you're asking them to do. Whether it's stay home for their own safety, and not just what you're asking them to do, but why. They want the rationale behind it. So make sure that you're being as transparent as you can be with that. Even when your company, and I saw a great example of this with, I think it was Airbus, 2 weeks ago, where the executives, the CEO came out and said, this is a trying time for our company. This is probably the most trying time we've ever had as a company. It's going to impact us. I can't tell you how. I don't know all the details, but I want you to know that we're fighting this battle together, and that we're all going to rally around it. What a great example. Now, that's a huge company, but it's no less important on a small scale. My wife runs a small veterinary clinic with 10 people working for her, and that was the conversation she wound up having with her team. Look, this is going to be hard, and it's probably going to involve shared sacrifice among all of us. And here's what we're going to do about it, and here's how you can help. And that had the intended effect of keeping her team together and moving through the crisis. So that's critically important. That they're also likely going to need some counseling and support depending on the situation. And we're already seeing with COVID-19 some real mental health concerns out in the communities where people are isolated, necessarily so, where they're struggling to make the connections that have fed their psyche for so long. And then they just need to know that you're supporting them as leaders in your organizations, that you have their back, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, honestly. I mean, then the last bucket here is about the community, and that is, I think you can draw some broad generalizations about what a community might need, but I would ask you to think through what the community needs from you and your organization, and jot down those things as well. That will help guide the strategy that you might have in communication, particularly as you start to recover. If you know that, I'm trying to think of a good example of it that's beyond healthcare. I live in this healthcare world so much that it's difficult these days for me to come up with anything that's beyond that. But think about something as many people may think is frivolous, but getting a haircut. Well, there's image matters, and people want to look good for their meetings, their connections with others, their Zoom calls. You can see my hair is a little bit longer than it normally is. What does the community need in that case? So think about steering your communications to those needs. It'll help. Go ahead.
And Chris, I was going to say too, when you're looking at this, right, and compare it to the previous talk about your content, your messaging, each of these buckets require a little bit different messaging, right? There's always messaging that's going to be consistent for sure during a crisis, but what you tell employees and how you tell them is going to be a little bit different than media or even customers. So you can use this chart to sort of bucket how you want to segment your messaging.
Yeah, and just to add one last thing to that, we can go to the next slide, is timing matters, and the cadence, and how you sequence those messages. So I would always argue that you want your employees as your best ambassadors first. So make sure they're team first, and then move to the public arena. And that's the process we follow here. It's how we worked at the World Bank and others. Occasionally it doesn't work out that way, but if that's your goal, you've set that expectation with your employees that they will be the first to know, then it's worth keeping up with that. This is a really quick slide, but it kind of it summarizes a lot of what it takes to communicate in a crisis. Be your genuine self. Make sure you're embodying the corporate values that your organization has, or your own personal values, or both. Hopefully they align. Make sure that transparency is a top priority for you. Be empathetic. People want to know that you have their back, that you're thoughtful about their needs and sensitive to their needs and concerns. I can't say this enough, but rumors run rampant in a crisis, and you can see it if you just spend a day watching any news outlet. You can see it running through. They're having to fill time during their schedule, and they're openly speculating and spinning, and asking questions that they have not verified the answers to. And that's a big challenge. It's part of the work of your PR folks and your communications folks to tamp that down. But make sure as you're talking to your teams even, that you're at least verifying the information you're giving them. And I try to do it with 2 sources of verification if I possibly can. And then the last one is an important one too. Don't speculate. If you don't know something, it's okay to say that, particularly in a crisis. What you don't want to have to do is say something and then an hour later or 2 hours later at the next news conference say, yeah, I remember when I said that wasn't actually true, and we need to go right instead of going left. Do your best not to speculate. The media absolutely wants you to do that. And your employees might too. The most popular question that we're getting right now, and not just here at Carilion, but elsewhere I'm hearing, is, when's this going to end? Well, you can give some idea that it's not going to end anytime soon, but I really hesitate to speculate on that. You've seen even the president and others have gotten in trouble by saying, oh, it's only going to be 50,000 deaths, and maybe we're looking for 200,000. Don't pin yourself down. Give yourself wide latitude as you respond to the crisis. You can go to the next slide.
So I wanted to just make you aware of some issues that we talked about after this pandemic that's going to affect your business and crisis communications. In fact, some things that we may not have thought about before are top and center, right? Customer health and safety. How many ads have you seen where, by the way, a lot of the advertising, they all have like the same music and message. We're in this together. But the fact is that whether you're a car dealer or barbershop, you have to now think and communicate how you're protecting the health and safety of your customers. And that's something that was always important, I would hope, but I think now has to be an outward message. Employee safety is the same thing. We don't want sick employees. We don't want injured employees. We want to take care of their mental health. And so that means that dealing with that and considering that in your communications is important. You're going to be dealing with consumer confidence. This is going to be a crisis for a lot of industries. People may not want to go back to the way things have been. They may not be confident enough to go out there and get their haircuts or buy that airline ticket or get that elective surgery. So communicating what you're doing to help their confidence is going to be important. The macroeconomic issues now, suddenly the economy's at a standstill. How's that going to affect your business? And that certainly is a crisis issue that you have to deal with. Supply chains, we've seen, whether it's for PPE equipment or, Lysol wipes that are right next to me here. We've seen toilet paper, we've seen supply chain issues that could affect your business too, and it could cause a crisis for you going forward as well. And government relations. We've seen how governments on the state level, local level, federal level have had to deal with this pandemic. And you may not have thought of your business in sort of that context, but the way governments are communicating will impact your own communications as well. So just something to think about as you develop your crisis plan. Next slide, please. Lots to think about as the state prepares to reopen. I know we're still a few weeks away, but some of the questions that you should think about is, how will you change your business, right, to address that health and safety that I just talked about? How are you going to communicate that? How are you going to make people feel welcome to come into your establishment or deal with your folks? How will you enforce social distancing? And that's particularly the case for a lot of foot traffic, maybe not in offices, but it does affect everyone. I know we're looking at that as well here. How do you make employees feel safe and welcome? What precautions do you have to put into place so that they can do their job effectively? Digital, right? The fact that we're on a Zoom call right now, I think has changed how people are using technology, and how will that affect your business, both from a revenue perspective, but also from an efficiency perspective, right? Visitors, how are you going to handle visitors? If you're in an office where maybe there's not a lot of foot traffic, what protocol do you have in place to make sure everyone stays safe? We talked about, protection equipment. What are your folks going to wear? Can you, in fact, deal with the next disruption, whatever that may be? And hopefully this session here today has got you thinking about any kind of crisis that can occur. This is also a good time, I think, for your own business to look at what worked and what didn't, and fix things now and address that in terms of communications. Maybe you had a challenge communicating to your customers what your business is going to be doing, or your employees didn't get the direction they needed as quickly as maybe you would have liked. This is a good time to reassess those things. And to the final point, go ahead and get that communications plan updated if you have one, and certainly put together, even if it's in a very practical way for your business. Next slide, please. I think we're ready for questions, right?
Yeah. Happy to take people's questions.
Fantastic. I'm going to allow everyone to unmute yourself. If you'll just stay muted if you're not asking a question, but otherwise we'd love to hear from you. I'll open it up to the floor first, and then I have some questions. I know you guys have questions. Come on. Let me ask one while they're thinking. I know that a lot of our small businesses, this is the first disaster they've ever been through. And so it's the first time they're thinking about any of this. And in realistic measures, if we have a business that just has 1 or 2 people working in it, they don't have a communications team, never thought about a communication plan, and don't blame them. It's just 2 or 3 people working in the business. But one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of is that our small businesses aren't communicating. We have many in this area that are doing an incredible job. So definitely want to highlight those, but we have some that we've worked directly with that they're so paralyzed and in to do mode, like how do I find funding? How am I going to survive this? And just the basics of day to day that they're not, and they might be thinking in the back of their head about communication, but it's just not something that they're able to wrap their head around in the moment. Could you give us just a couple of tips for them? Like, how can we get them to move through that process and understand that communicating is really just as important as all the other things that they're thinking about?
Yeah, I could start with that. Obviously, this is an enormous shock and quickly to the system. And as a former small business owner myself, I understand that there are the immediate concerns of getting the help you need or making payroll or all the things that business owners have to think about. I look at communications as not just in a crisis mode, right, but as an ongoing thing, right, to add value to your company, to increase your marketing, to drive sales, frankly. In this case, in this particular instance that you mentioned, where you're just so overwhelmed, I think it's important just to take a step back with a partner, with a friend, with a fellow business owner, and make sure that even if it's just 2 or 3 of you, and maybe not even a large customer base, that you do take some time to see how your customers are doing. They want to hear from you. You probably all received some email from some brand that you're following, telling them what they're doing about COVID and what, and you may, hit the delete on that. But I think it's important that your customers hear from you, even if maybe they're not directly affected, or that your business isn't necessarily affected by the foot traffic or the physical nature of this pandemic. So just carve out some time when you can breathe a little bit and see what your customers might want to hear from you. It may be a simple message like, how are you doing? It could be something like, hey, we haven't forgotten about you, or we're still, on target to do this and that. But it's mostly about, at this point, the empathy and seeing how they're doing.
Yeah, I would just add, Thomas, I think, is right on the money. You've got to find, if you're a small business owner, 1 or 2 man shop, you've got to find a community of peers that you can commiserate
right.
with.
Yep.
That's critical. It's how my wife is handling this with her veterinary colleagues around the country, connecting on how are you strategizing around this and what are you doing with that. But it's also, for those who aren't communicating, I would suggest a mental model shift, right? Communication is essential to keep your business running.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the core of it. And so figure out how you can be genuine with the concerns and the challenges you're facing, and let your community know that you're facing those challenges in a meaningful way. And even if there's ways that the community can help. I mean, I've heard of, I'm going to keep going back to the hair cutting analogy because there's some good examples there, but I've heard of folks, who haven't been able to go see their hairdresser in the last month, still paying for that appointment that they never had, just to help keep their hairdresser afloat. People are willing to do that right now. And
yeah,
the challenges you're facing, you have a much better shot at developing that community even more.
Right. And depending on the business you're in, I mean, if you are transparent and you do have empathy and you're laying it out on the line, I've seen a lot of small business owners put it out there on Facebook. And to Chris's point, the community has responded. And so even if you communicate and you feel that, everyone's got their problems, I shouldn't share mine, think about it as, how can you frame that in a way that you're, potentially getting some help, but also potentially wanting to or willing to help the community. But Chris is right. I think if anything, this is a time to look at your own communications now, whether it's a crisis or not, on an ongoing basis with your customers, and make that a management priority.
That's awesome. Thank you, guys. There's a couple of things I want to make sure. Everything that you said is amazing. And there's 2 things I want to make sure people remember. And that, we've been preaching this, and I love that you guys mentioned get together with another business owner or other, but small group of people, because man, even, ourselves at the Small Business Development Center, we're incredibly overwhelmed too. And it's hard to like back away from that and get your head clear and okay, what's the plan? And when you can do that with someone else, it's so critical. And being a business owner can be a lonely place.
Yes.
So I love that. And the other thing I wanted to share that I think is really cool, I've a couple of folks that we've been working with don't have a lot of work for their employees, but they were able to get PPP funds to bring them back off of unemployment. And they've got projects and things that they're working on, but one in particular literally is just taking their customer list, and the staff is just calling their customers and saying, how are you doing? They're not trying to sell them anything. They're just like,
Yep.
How are you doing? How are you doing with this? With nothing in mind, but just checking in. And I thought that was, I'm not sure that company saw it as a marketing opportunity, but what a great way to personally reach out if that time and staff is available to you.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Really cool stuff. What other questions? Do you guys have anything before we wrap it up? We've got a couple minutes left.
Hi guys, this is Corey Prater. I am over at the Salem Civic Center. Hi Thomas.
Hey there.
We're kind of in a unique position, I guess, because our business is people and social distancing is not possible in 99% of what we do. I have taken, I guess, with our social media, have taken the look of, I'm just reaching out. I'm doing Feel Good Fridays. I'm posting cute animal videos. Any suggestion on how to better communicate with our clients when I really have nothing to communicate about because we don't have any events?
No, and I feel for the venue industry and all that. I saw a meme the other day where someone said, boy, I missed that overpriced beer, at a concert.
No joke. I'd give anything to pay $7 for a hot beer.
But I think in your case, continue to do what you're doing, be authentic and true to the brand. Maybe you do a throwback where you have a link to a previous concert or something. I think people right now are looking to feel good, and they're looking for little reminders of what it's going to be like in the future, even with changes. You're going to have enormous, obviously, impact with the social distancing thing. So, get away from that a little bit and remind people what's possible to be together again as a community. Ask them what they'd like to see. If people are pent up, this is a good time to get people engaged on the type of events that you may want to bring in there, right?
Cool. Thank you.
That's awesome suggestions. Thank you, guys. Anything else we can answer? I saw someone, I don't take credit for this. It might have been, I don't even know who it was. Someone said to the likes that how we treat our staff and our customers right now and how we communicate with them right now in this moment will really define who we are well into the future. Mm-hmm. And that certainly gave me pause when I heard that. And I hate that I can't reference who said that, but you may have, there's memes and all kinds of stuff about it, but I think it just because it creates pause to understand that if we communicate with our stress and fear, right, because that's our first typical response, if we don't have a communication plan that can guide us, that could really impact us. So taking the time to think about that communication and what could be incredibly helpful, like you guys have mentioned today, is going to be critical, not just now, but for the future reputation of your business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there any final comments you guys want to leave us with?
I was going to offer one thing. I try to remind people, because this is, as you said, Amanda, this may be different for a lot of people, or new to a lot of people. I think the important thing to note about any of the planning that you do, it's not rocket science. It doesn't have to be super complicated. It really shouldn't be, because you want to be able to respond intentionally and quickly when you need to. But it does take some time. It takes some thought, but it doesn't have to be hard work. And that's one thing I would love to leave folks with. This doesn't have to. It just doesn't have to be as hard as you may be thinking it is.
That's awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us, Chris and Thomas. We really appreciate your expertise and guiding us through this. I get on these calls all the time, but I rarely take notes because I just like to listen. And even though I have access to this, I've got front and back tiny writing all over the place so that we can share some of these nuggets with our clients, and then maybe use some of these tips for our communication too. So thank you guys.
Excellent.
And for everyone that's on the call with us today, I will make sure that you have a recorded version of this presentation, as well as the slides. So PDF document with the slides. So if there's a slide you want to like print off and keep handy, you'll be able to do that. And we really appreciate you guys taking time out. I know everyone is busy and anxious and trying to get all the things done. And so we really appreciate you taking time out to be with us today and having this conversation. You can expect to hear more from us at the Small Business Development Center. We are working on not only our communication plan, but our recovery plan for the coming even year. So you'll be hearing a lot more from us around that and other events that you can join us for. And maybe Chris and Thomas, you guys can be part of something in the future as well. Really enjoyed hearing from you today. So have an incredible day today. Get busy on those communication plans and thinking about that. And if you want to talk through that with anyone, our advisors of the Small Business Development Center are available. We have availability this week. You can schedule with us. You can reach us on our website, roanokesmallbusiness.org. And we have an advising page there, and you can schedule with us to talk through. Sometimes it's just helpful to have someone to talk through this with, or if you have a couple other business owners and we all want to get on the phone, we can certainly do that and work through that together. So feel free to reach out to us. Have a great day, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks,
Bye, guys.
everybody.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Bye-bye.
Bye.